Hello and welcome to this video on the impact of economic growth. So in this video we're going to look at the benefits of economic growth to a range of economic agents, and we're also going to look at some of the costs of economic growth. So let's start off looking at the benefits. Now, what are the benefits of real GDP increase, an increase in national income to citizens within an economy? Well, as incomes and wealth rise, there is economic growth, and that should really improve standards of living. So as there is more being produced in the economy, there should be more to go around per person, and therefore a higher standard of living, as long as inflation is not rising at the same rate. So what we're really concerned with in terms of the benefits to citizens is real GDP growth. Real GDP adjusted for the impact of inflation means that real incomes rise and the standard of living should be increasing. Alongside this, another benefit of economic growth for citizens is there's maybe more employment opportunities. As more is being produced, there are more opportunities to go into work. And finally, as economic growth rises, we should see a reduction in absolute poverty. So those people who on an absolute basis have less than a certain amount to live off per day, that should go down as the economy becomes wealthier. Now let's look at the benefits of economic growth to firms within our economy. So as the economy grows, firms tend to make more revenue and consequently more profit. When the economy is growing, consumer confidence is normally high, increasing revenues even further. Larger profits for the firm allow them to invest, maybe take on more workers or expand, causing further economic growth. But do remember that if firms are making inferior goods, they're likely to suffer because as incomes rise, demand for their products falls. This would be a good evaluation point. Let's look at the benefits of economic growth to governments. Well, when incomes and asset values rise, the government should receive more in tax, both through income tax and also capital gains tax. If there's more economic growth and more employment, then there is less need for the government to pay unemployment benefits. So this is a benefit to them financially. So in theory, economic growth should lead to a government surplus, where the money they get in tax revenue is greater than the money they're spending on welfare payments and benefits and things like that. Economic growth is often considered to be a symbol of effective government. So one of the benefits to governments of economic growth is that it's a good way of getting re-elected. Okay, so we've looked at the benefits of economic growth. Now let's consider some of the costs of economic growth. One of the costs we need to consider is to the environment. If more and more is being produced, then we have to question whether this has been done in a sustainable manner. If there's a finite number of resources, and by growing the economy we're using those finite resources, then is that a cost to the environment? Those resources can't be then used in future. So it might be unsustainable. Also, the resources are increasingly expensive and become more scarce. A lot of economic processes, so manufacturing and making goods and services, involves damage to the environment. So maybe it's a particularly carbon emitting production process, then we need to think about the external costs of pollution to the environment that are associated with economic growth. We also need to consider the effects on the human environment. So economic growth, if we're pursuing more and more goods and services being produced, if that results in more stress and less leisure time for people within our population, then how do we quantify the cost of that economic growth? However, we should always consider that governments could use the tax revenue from the additional economic growth to maybe address some of those costs. So for example, they could use the tax revenues generated from increased economic growth to tidy up some of the pollution, or to try and make sure that resources are more sustainable. Right, a second cost of economic growth is to do with income inequality. So the idea that the distribution of income between the very richest and the very poorest in society gets wider. So often low-paid and low-skilled workers do not particularly benefit from economic growth. It tends to be the owner of the businesses that benefit to the most part. So that would worsen their income equality. So real growth may increase incomes of the most skilled or the owners of the factors of production. So we're going to see widening income inequality with consequences for social functioning. So we might have societies in which there are very, very rich people and very poor people, and in consequences again for unemployment. A few rich, skilled individuals employed, and a larger amount of people, lower skilled, who are unemployed. Widening income inequality will increase relative poverty. So while economic growth might reduce absolute poverty, the relative distribution, so poor compared to the rest of the people within society, might increase. Okay, another cost we need to be aware of is on the balance of payments. So at higher incomes, consumers may increase their level of imports. And firms making profit in their own country also have less need to export. And both of these factors combined may worsen the balance of payments, in particular the current account. However, if the economic growth has come through an increase in exports in the first place, for example, when we look at China, then maybe this cost wouldn't apply. Again, that would be a good evaluation point. Okay, our final cost of economic growth is the opportunity cost. So with the government consistently pursuing or choosing to pursue economic growth, there may be other areas or other objectives that they're not focusing on in terms of their policies. Sometimes spending on welfare can have a negative effect on growth as well. So the choosing to spend on that may actually have a negative effect on economic growth. Should they perhaps be spending more on foreign aid? Should they perhaps be spending more improving the standards of the living? Or should they be standards of living for the poorest? Or should they be focusing more maybe on the happiness of the population? But instead they're focusing primarily on economic growth and ignoring some of these other things like welfare, foreign aid, the poorest, and happiness. Another thing to consider is that pursuing short-term economic growth in terms of producing more consumer goods at the expense of capital goods may mean that there is lower economic growth tomorrow, because tomorrow there's a lack of capital goods and therefore we're not able to produce as many consumer goods. So in this video we've looked at some of the benefits of economic growth and also some of the costs of economic growth. That's it. Thank you very much.